She rode 400 miles on a promise written in another man's handwriting. When she stepped off that stagecoach, the man waiting for her took one look, laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear, and pointed her toward a cabin with a hole in its roof and a door hanging off one hinge. He thought she would cry. He thought she would climb back on that stagecoach and go home. She didn't. She stood in the dust of Ashbourne Ridge, looked him dead in the eye, and made him a promise of her own, one he would spend the next year watching come true, board by board, right across the fence line from his own front porch. If you have ever been laughed at by someone who underestimated exactly what you were capable of, stay close. This one is for you. The town of Ashbourne Ridge sat in a shallow valley in the Wyoming Territory, the kind of place where the wind never fully stopped and the mountains turned gold before anything else did. It was the spring of 1883, and the stagecoach that rolled in that afternoon carried a woman with a trunk full of practical dresses, a small leather ledger, and her late father's brass surveying compass. Grace Whitaker was 31 years old, dark-haired, plain-spoken, and long used to being underestimated by men who mistook her quiet manner for meekness. Back in Ohio, she had spent 9 years keeping the books for a milling company that would have gone under twice without her catching the errors nobody else wanted to find. When the mill was sold and the new owners brought in their own men, Grace found herself with a tidy set of skills, very little savings, and even fewer prospects. She had watched other women her age settle for far less than they deserved, simply because waiting for something better felt too much like a gamble. A mail-order arrangement had seemed, at the time, like the practical choice rather than the romantic one. Mason Whitaker's letters had described a working ranch, a sturdy house, and a man who wanted a partner, not a servant. On the long ride west, Grace had allowed herself, just a little, to imagine a life that matched those letters. None of it turned out to be true. Mason was waiting on the platform with his arms crossed and a crowd of townsfolk who had clearly been told to expect a show. He was a big man, sunburned and stubbled, with the kind of swagger that came from never once being told no. He looked Grace over the way a man looks over a horse he already regrets buying, and he did not lower his voice. "You're smaller than I pictured," Mason said, "and older." A few people laughed. Grace did not. "That cabin down by the creek," Mason went on, jerking his thumb toward a leaning structure with a sagging roof and a door rotted clean off its bottom hinge. "That's yours. Fix it up if you want. I've got no use for a wife who can't keep a roof over her own head." The crowd waited to see her crumble. Grace set down her trunk instead, straightened her spine, and let the silence stretch just long enough that everyone on that platform understood she was not afraid of it. "I did not travel 400 miles to be handed a ruin and a rude welcome," she said, loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "You'll keep your cabin, Mr. Whitaker. I intend to build something better, and I'll build it close enough that you can watch it rise from your own window." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Ethan Whitaker stepped out from among them. Ethan was Mason's younger brother by 2 years, a carpenter and rancher with quiet hands and a way of standing that made people listen when he finally spoke. He had watched his brother humiliate a stranger in front of half the town, and something in him had reached its limit. "Mason," Ethan said, "you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Mason laughed it off, waving a hand like he was shooing a fly. Ethan didn't laugh. He walked straight up to Grace, took off his hat, and offered her something no one on that platform expected. "I've got 160 acres next to my brother's land, and I know how to raise a house that'll stand for 50 years, he said. "You've got a mind for numbers, from what I hear, and enough grit to make my brother's jaw drop just now. Marry me instead, Miss Whitaker, and we'll build something neither of us could build alone." Grace studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer the way she weighed every column in her ledger, looking for the catch, before she trusted the sum. "Let's go see the land, Mr. Whitaker," she said finally, "and bring your accounts. I want to understand exactly how your brother's cattle operation really runs before I put my name on anything of yours." Hello, gentle viewers, and thank you for being here. Before we continue, if this story has already found a place in your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone who loves a good story. We would love to know you. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and I promise I will read every single one. By subscribing today, you're joining a community that still believes in stories, with heart, grit, and a happy ending worth waiting for. Thank you for your support. Now, let's return to Grace and Ethan. Ethan's land sat on a gentle rise above the creek, 160 acres of good grass, timber stands, and a spring that ran clear even in the driest months. Grace walked the property with her father's compass in hand, taking sightings and jotting figures into her ledger, while Ethan trailed a respectful step behind, watching her work with something close to fascination. "This spring sits higher than the creek that runs past your brother's place," she said, kneeling to check her figures against the slope of the land. "That matters more than either of you seems to realize." "How so?" "Water rights in this territory follow the highest point of use on record, not the loudest claim shouted at a fence line. Whoever controls the spring head controls the water flowing below it, whether the man downstream likes it or not. Your brother built his cabin downstream and never once checked the county charter before he did." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly turning the idea over for the first time. "You learned all that from a milling ledger?" "I learned it from reading every document anyone ever asked me to sign," Grace said. "Most people don't read anything before they put their name on it. That's usually where the trouble starts in my experience. And I have seen a great deal of trouble start exactly that way." They rode into town together the next morning to buy nails, rope, and window glass at Wyatt Carter's general store. Wyatt was a stout, good-humored man who had run the store for 15 years and prided himself on fair dealing, though his suppliers' invoices had grown sloppy of late without his noticing. While Ethan gathered supplies, Grace asked, out of habit more than anything, whether she might glance through the store's ledger. Wyatt handed it over without much thought, expecting nothing more than polite interest. Within 10 minutes, Grace had found a $45 overcharge buried in a column of freight fees, hidden under a rounding error that repeated itself month after month. "Your supplier has been rounding up on every shipment since March," she told him, turning the ledger so he could see the pattern for himself. "Add that across a full year, Mr. Carter, and you are losing a good deal more than you would ever guess by eye alone." Wyatt studied the numbers twice before he believed them, running a thick finger down the column as though the figures might rearrange themselves. "Nobody's caught that in 3 years of shipments," he said. "Miss Whitaker, if you ever want honest work in this town, you have a standing offer from me, and I mean that." Later that evening, sitting by lantern light in Ethan's half-finished barn, Grace opened her ledger again and showed Ethan something simpler, a trick her father had taught her before he passed. "There's a shortcut called the Rule of 72, she said, sketching the numbers on a scrap of paper. "Divide 72 by whatever interest rate you're earning, and you'll know roughly how many years it takes your money to double on its own. Save at 6%, and your savings double in 12 years without you lifting a finger past the saving itself. It isn't magic. It's simply arithmetic that nobody bothers teaching a working man." Ethan turned the number over in his head, slow and careful, the way he studied a length of timber before he cut it. "So, if we keep every dollar of profit working instead of spending it, then we build this house without ever owing a bank a single cent," Grace finished. "That is the whole of my plan, Mr. Whitaker, and I intend to see it through." They signed their partnership before the territorial magistrate 3 days later, an equal marriage contract, drafted in Grace's own careful hand, splitting the land, the labor, and the profits evenly between them, down to the last clause. Mason heard about it before the ink had fully dried and rode straight into town to see the document with his own eyes, certain there must be some trick in it he could use against them later. He read it twice, scowled, and folded it back up without finding a single word out of place. Grace only smiled and returned the paper to her satchel, already thinking 3 steps ahead of him. Spring turned to early summer, and the work began in earnest. Mason, still stinging from the contract signing and the laughter it had cost him around town, tried to block the wagon trail that ran along the creek, claiming the water beneath it belonged to him by right of first arrival. Grace met him at the fence line, with the territorial land charter rolled under her arm, unhurried, as though she had expected this exact confrontation days before it happened. "Read the water clause yourself, Mr. Whitaker," she said, holding the document open between them. "Rights follow the highest recorded spring head, and that spring sits on our land, not yours. You are welcome to keep drawing from the creek as you always have. You are not welcome to block a public trail simply to prove a point that the law has already settled against you." Mason read it, swore under his breath, and rode off without another word, though the look on his face promised he would not forget the exchange. Ethan, meanwhile, had begun felling timber for the frame of their house, choosing straight, tall Douglas firs and marking each log for a full season of curing before it was ever touched by a saw. Grace watched him work one afternoon, drawn by the steady rhythm of the axe and the care he took over each mark on the bark. "Balloon framing goes up faster," he explained, running his hand along a freshly squared beam. "But it's built from thin studs nailed edge to edge, and thin studs shift and rot inside 20 years if the weather gets at them. Post and beam framing uses joints like this one instead, a mortise cut into one beam, a tenon shaped to fit it exactly, no nails needed at the joint at all. A house built this way can stand 100 years if the timber is cured properly first. And if the timber isn't cured, then it warps as it dries out on its own, and every joint you cut goes crooked behind it, sometimes years after the house is already standing. Patience now saves grief later. That's true of good lumber, and it's true of most everything else I've ever put my hand to." Grace laughed at that. A real laugh, the first one Ethan had heard from her since she stepped off the stagecoach. Encouraged, he taught her to handle a crosscut saw that same afternoon, standing close behind her to correct the angle of her grip, guiding the blade until it found its own rhythm. Something quiet passed between them in that hour, unspoken but plainly felt by them both, and neither one rushed to name it aloud. That night, walking back toward the half-built house under a wide sky full of stars neither of them had grown used to yet, Grace found herself admitting something she had not planned to say. "I expected to spend this year regretting my decision to come west," she told him. "I did not expect to spend it building something I was proud of." "Give it time," Ethan said. "We are only just getting started, Grace." Humiliated by the water rights dispute, Mason rode into town and tried to charge a wagon load of tools to Ethan's account at Wyatt Carter's store, assuming old habits would hold. Wyatt, working from the new credit ledger Grace had helped him organize the week before, refused the charge outright. "Your name's not on this account anymore, Mason," Wyatt said, not unkindly, but without hesitation either. "Hasn't been since the partnership papers came through the courthouse." Furious and short on cash, Mason found a new ally that same week, in Caleb Walker, a well-dressed land speculator who had quietly bought up mortgages across half the valley over the past several years. Walker offered Mason easy credit at what sounded, on the surface, like a perfectly fair rate, buried inside paperwork thick enough that Mason never bothered reading past the first page. Around the same time, Sarah Montgomery, a sharp-eyed widow who sat on the town's small lending board and had buried a husband who trusted the wrong men too easily, noticed the precision of Grace's bookkeeping at a town council meeting. She approached Grace afterward and asked, carefully, whether she might review the board's own ledgers as a personal favor. What Grace found troubled her deeply. Buried in the fine print of Walker's standard loan agreements was an interest rate of 18%, nearly 3 times the 12% cap set firmly by territorial law and printed, in far smaller type, on the very same page. "He is charging half the ranchers in this valley an illegal rate," Grace told Sarah quietly, spreading the paperwork across the widow's kitchen table. "And not one of them has noticed, because not one of them has read past the line where they sign their own name." "Can you prove it in a courtroom, Grace? Not just at this table?" "I can prove it in my sleep, Sarah," Grace said. "Give me a week, and bring me every ledger you can lay your hands on, without drawing attention to yourself." By midsummer, the stone foundation of the Whitaker house was laid, and the first floor joists were set squarely in place. A sudden storm rolled down from the mountains one evening, without much warning, threatening to flood the new foundation trenches before the mortar had properly cured in the July heat. Grace and Ethan worked through the driving rain by lantern light, digging shallow trenches lined with gravel around the foundation's outer edge, soaked through within the first 10 minutes and past caring about it soon after. "French drains," Grace called over the wind, hauling a bucket of gravel toward the trench line. "My father used the very same trick around our cellar back home in Ohio. Water always finds the lowest, easiest path available to it. Give it a gravel channel to follow, and it will travel there instead of pooling against your foundation stones. And if we don't give it one tonight, then the ground beneath the footings swells every time it rains from here on, and it slowly cracks your foundation apart from below, one freeze and thaw at a time. Most folks never notice the damage until the whole wall begins to lean, and by then, it is far too late to fix cheaply." By the time the storm finally passed, they were both soaked through and laughing despite themselves, sheltering under the half-raised roof of the barn, while lightning flickered out over the ridge behind them. Ethan brushed a strand of wet hair from Grace's face, without quite meaning to, and this time, neither of them pulled away from the moment that followed. Their first kiss happened there, quiet and unhurried, lit only by a guttering lantern and the last of the storm rolling east toward the mountains. Neither said much afterward. They didn't need to. They simply sat together on an overturned crate until the rain stopped, her shoulder against his, watching the sky clear over land that was slowly becoming theirs in more ways than one. Determined to outdo his brother after weeks of quiet humiliation, Mason tried to raise his own barn without a single square measurement taken, working alone late into the evenings out of stubborn pride. When his cattle leaned against the unbraced wall a week later, the whole structure folded sideways into the mud, with a groan the whole valley seemed to hear, and half of Ashbourne Ridge came out to watch it happen from a respectful distance. Mason spent the better part of a month living down the story at the general store, where Wyatt, to his credit, never once brought it up first. Grace, meanwhile, used the season's timber profits to order kiln-fired red brick from the rail depot 2 counties over, funding the purchase entirely from savings rather than a single borrowed dollar, exactly as she had promised Ethan on their first night working the numbers together. Sarah Montgomery invited her to an afternoon tea attended by several of the town's more opinionated ladies, who spent the first half hour speculating loudly about Grace's marriage arrangement within easy earshot of her. Grace let them finish their speculating, sipping her tea without comment, then calmly laid out the freight numbers behind the region's new rail line and precisely how much cheaper building materials had become for anyone willing to do the arithmetic themselves rather than repeat rumors. The gossip did not survive the numbers for very long, and by the end of the afternoon, 2 of the loudest ladies were asking Grace's opinion on their own household accounts instead. "You did not raise your voice once," Sarah said afterward, clearly delighted. "You simply let them run out of things to say. Facts tend to do that on their own," Grace said, "if you give them room enough." That evening, Ethan surprised Grace with an antique brass desk for the office she was building inside their unfinished house, hauled in on a borrowed wagon and polished until it caught the lamplight. "A woman who runs numbers the way you do deserves a proper place to run them," he said, setting it carefully against the window wall. "I mean to keep you here a long while, Grace Whitaker. Might as well make the arrangement comfortable while I'm at it." "You're getting sentimental on me, Ethan," Grace said, though she was smiling as she said it, and she ran her hand over the desk's smooth surface for a long moment before she trusted herself to say anything more. By early autumn, it was time to raise the central hall of the house, the tallest, most difficult section of the frame, and the one Ethan had planned longest for. Half the town turned out to help, as was custom in a valley where barn raising still meant something, and Ethan's joinery fit together so cleanly that the great beams rose almost without effort, settling into place with a solid, satisfying sound that drew a cheer from the gathered crowd. In the middle of the raising, with the frame only half assembled, Caleb Walker arrived uninvited, with 2 hired men in tow, claiming loudly that the new driveway crossed onto a railroad right-of-way he personally controlled. Grace climbed down from the scaffolding without hurry, her father's compass and the county's official land plats already in hand, as though she had half expected this visit all along. "Let's measure it together, Mr. Walker," she said, unrolling the plats across a sawhorse table in full view of everyone present. "Right here, in front of the whole town, so there can be no argument afterward about what the survey shows." She took her sightings carefully, laid the numbers against the recorded boundary markers, and proved, point by measured point, that Walker's own survey stakes had been quietly moved 30 feet south of their true, recorded line sometime in the past year. "Your stakes are wrong, Mr. Walker. Not our driveway," Grace said, loud enough for every witness present to hear clearly. "I would move them back myself before the county surveyor comes out to check the discrepancy on his own." The crowd's laughter chased Walker back to his wagon before he could manage a proper reply. He left without another word, though the look he gave Grace on his way out promised, unmistakably, that the matter was far from settled between them. By sundown, the great hall stood framed against the darkening sky, and the whole gathering shared a meal laid out on long tables beneath it, passing plates and stories back and forth until the stars came out fully over the ridge. By the time the veranda and the tall front windows were finished, the house had become the talk of 3 counties, drawing visitors simply curious to see it for themselves. Walker, watching his loan business shrink week by week as word of his illegal rates spread quietly through the valley, decided the house needed to fail before it could be finished and celebrated. Late one night, he paid Mason a considerable sum to loosen the iron support pins along the second-story balcony, framing the request as nothing more than harmless mischief meant to knock Ethan down a peg. Ethan caught his brother slipping off the property at dawn the following morning, tools still in his coat pocket, guilt written plainly across his face before he said a single word. Ethan did not raise his voice, though he had every right to. He simply asked why, standing quiet in the gray morning light, until Mason found the courage to answer him honestly, for the first time in months. Mason broke down before he finished his second sentence, admitting everything at once: the debt he owed Walker, the bribe he had taken, and Walker's growing scheme to bankrupt half the ranchers in the valley through rigged loans and quiet acts of sabotage like the one he'd nearly carried out that very night. "I wanted you to fail," Mason admitted, unable to meet his brother's eyes, "so my own failure wouldn't look so plain standing next to yours." "You didn't need to ruin me to matter, Mason," Ethan said quietly, more sad than angry. "You only ever needed to try half as hard as she has." Ethan and Grace repaired the balcony that same week, checking every pin and joint twice over. And with Sarah Montgomery's quiet help, they began gathering the evidence needed to end Walker's scheme for good, working late into the evenings over Grace's brass desk, while Mason, shamed but no longer hiding, brought them what records he still had from his own dealings with Walker. The house was finished by the first frost, and Grace and Ethan held a harvest gathering to mark it properly. Half the valley in attendance, long tables of food spread across the new lawn, and lanterns strung along the veranda Ethan had built with his own 2 hands over the course of a long year. Walker, cornered by the evidence closing in around him and increasingly desperate, sent 2 hired men to set fire to the timber barn during the celebration, hoping the chaos would cover his tracks one final time. The flames caught fast in the dry autumn air, and the first shout of alarm cut straight through the music and laughter. Ethan ran into the smoke without hesitation to secure the main support beam before it could bring the roof down on the animals still trapped inside. Grace, keeping her head while others scattered, organized the gathered crowd into a bucket line fed by the pressure of their gravity-driven spring system, the very water source Mason had once tried, and failed, to claim as his own. In the chaos, the sheriff caught one of Walker's hired men still holding a coil of rigging rope and a set of forged land deeds meant for a neighboring ranch, evidence he had been too rushed to hide properly. Grace produced the ledgers she and Sarah had assembled over the past month, laying them out on the same sawhorse table where she had once corrected Walker's stolen survey line, exposing his illegal interest rates, his forged surveys, and now, in front of the whole gathering, his hand in the arson as well. "Every number in this ledger is written in his own hand, Sheriff," Grace said, her voice steady even with smoke still hanging in the air behind her. "You will not need to take my word for any of it. The numbers speak plainly enough on their own. Caleb Walker was arrested on charges of fraud, illegal lending, and arson before the week was out. His remaining assets were seized by the territory and used to repay every rancher he had overcharged across the valley, Mason included, though Mason insisted on repaying his own debt to Ethan separately, in labor rather than cash. Mason, humbled and genuinely ashamed, for the first time in his life, signed his failing cabin parcel over to Ethan and Grace without being asked, and requested only a train ticket west and a chance to start honest work somewhere nobody remembered the man he had been. Ethan shook his brother's hand at the depot and told him plainly that the door home would stay open, should he ever earn his way back to it through his own effort. Wyatt Carter and Sarah Montgomery, with Grace's steady help, founded a small fair lending board for the valley that same winter, capping every rate firmly at the legal limit and publishing every ledger openly for any rancher to inspect at will. Grace was named its first bookkeeper, a position she took on gladly, working the numbers alongside running her own growing household with the same care she gave to everything else. That evening, Ethan led Grace up to the balcony Mason had once tried to bring down, overlooking 400 acres of pasture turning gold in the last light of the day, the whole valley spread out below them in quiet, settled peace. "I ought to have proposed to you properly the first week you arrived," he said, slipping a plain gold band onto her finger, with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady, instead of standing in a crowd of strangers and offering you what sounded like little more than a business arrangement. "You offered me a partnership, Ethan," Grace said, turning the ring gently in the fading light, "when every other man in this valley would have offered me a cage, dressed up in kinder words. I'll take a partnership over a proper proposal any day of the week, and I would choose you again tomorrow if I had to start this whole year over." 2 years passed, gently, and then all at once, the way good years tend to. The house that had started as a promise made in the dust of a stagecoach platform now stood as the finest working ranch in 3 counties. Full pastures, a fair lending board that had already saved a dozen families from ruin, and a porch wide enough for the whole family to gather come evening, exactly as Grace had once pictured it in the margins of her ledger. Grace and Ethan welcomed their first child that spring, a daughter with her father's steady hands and, everyone in town agreed within the first week, her mother's unmistakably sharp eyes. They sat together on the front porch as the sun went down over land that had once been nothing but a rejected woman's promise and a rotting cabin down by the creek, the whole valley quiet and gold around them. Grace thought back, sometimes, to the platform where it had all begun, the laughter, the ruin she had been offered instead of a welcome, and the choice she had made in that single moment to build something entirely her own rather than accept what she had been handed. She had not needed anyone's permission to succeed, and she had not needed to shout to prove her point either. She had only needed one honest partner willing to meet her as an equal, a fair set of numbers that did not lie, and the plain nerve to stay exactly where she was when staying meant proving someone wrong, one board and one season at a time. Mason wrote twice a year from a small spread out west, steady work in his letters, and slowly, something like pride. Wyatt's store thrived under its new honest ledgers. Sarah's lending board grew every season. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the lanterns were lit along the veranda, Grace would sometimes catch Ethan watching her across the porch, the way he had that very first afternoon by the creek, and she understood, finally and completely, that she had built exactly the life she'd promised herself on that dusty platform. Not out of spite toward the man who had doubted her, but simply because she had always known she was capable of it.